The war in Syria as Aleppo is bombarded with airstrikes. Can the recently broken ceasefire be restored? And is there any hope for future peace talks? The United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, joins me from the UN. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. This is The Heat. The war in Syria took another deadly turn on Friday as new attacks were launched on the city of Aleppo. Dozens are reported killed in airstrikes after the Syrian government announced an offensive to retake areas of the city controlled by rebels. It's another major setback for the country following a ceasefire put together by Russia and the United States earlier this month. But the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, says the ceasefire needs to be revitalized, and he's even hopeful on the future of peace talks. I talked with him earlier today. Thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Peace appears to be very elusive in Syria right now. That ceasefire that was brokered by the United States and Russia has fallen apart, and we are hearing right now reports coming out of Syria that the government has launched a new offensive to retake rebel-held areas around the city of Aleppo. What is the status of the ceasefire right now? Can it be salvaged?
Yes, it can, and frankly, must be salvaged. The alternative is just a complete and total warfare in Syria, and Syria has seen that for 5 years with 400,000 people killed. Now, the ceasefire agreed on the 9th of September between the Russian Federation and the Americans has not been declared dead by them, and they are the only ones who can do so. What we do see is that it is in great danger of collapsing completely and needs to be revitalized. Otherwise, we will have just war, and the Syrians don't need that.
How difficult is it to implement a ceasefire of this kind? Because there's no kind of enforcement mechanism that will hold parties responsible for breaking that ceasefire accountable.
You have a very good point there. So that's why if we had the ceasefire starting, I would not be surprised that we would be seeing also a Security Council resolution related to the ceasefire. But it needs to be given a chance. That's why these famous 7 days were so important and are important in order to show that there is a genuine intention and capability of ensuring that the ceasefire is going to be held.
Now, you are in continuous negotiations on efforts to find peace in Syria right now. You've been meeting with the Secretary General at the UN, Ban Ki-moon. He has called on the Security Council to give its support to your efforts. What are the latest efforts that you are making right now?
Well, first of all, let's say first things first. And the first thing is to help both Russia and the US, and with the help of the regional players, that the cessation of hostility, ceasefire, reduction of violence at least, takes place. Second, that humanitarian aid moves. Don't forget, that's what the Syrian people are asking. If we mean what we say, that it is, we are supposed to listen and to help the Syrian people, they're asking for that. We don't want bombs, we want more trucks, more aid. And at the same time, clarify the issue which has been ambiguous regarding al-Nusra and the rest of the armed opposition, and grounding then the Syrian Air Force, which means there would be no more barrel bombs. All that would be very positive when and if implemented in order to launch, without preconditions, but still much positive if it did take place, in order to relaunch the intra-Syrian talks.
You raise an important point there, talking about al-Nusra. There are believed to be something like 1,000 armed groups in Syria. The total number of fighters are believed to be in the region of about 100,000. They are not all at the table. How do you get everyone to abide by any kind of agreement?
Well, let's look at facts. You remember 26th of February, when in fact Russia and America did agree and were able, through the ISSG, to engage all the sponsors or the countries engaged or involved or supporting one side or the other to actually agree to it. And we had 2 months, basically, of no fighting. And the government did not fly and didn't bomb, and the other side didn't do the same. So it's possible. There is a need of a political will. And I think the fact that the Russians and Americans have not declared yet, and I hope they will not, that the ceasefire agreement they have made is dead, shows that they are still working until the last moment in order to revitalize it. I tell you again, the alternative is just war. And by the way, taking over Aleppo doesn't mean being able to hold it, doesn't mean that you win the war. You need still to actually find a political solution.
And looking for that political solution, what are the prospects for direct talks between the two sides?
In my opinion, not only they are good, but they are indispensable. We have already had proximity talks now 3 times. They were useful because they helped the various sides to be able to express to us, without having them to meet or actually to fight verbally between them, their own positions. We know them by now. We know also their own vision. There is a point when you need to negotiate. Negotiate means compromise as well, means being able to talk to each other and eventually even make concessions.
Now, there have been meetings at the UN General Assembly going on all week. Has there anything come out of these meetings that gives you hope that some progress will be made?
Yes, because all the meetings I've been attending, and we are still attending them, are clearly indicating that none of the countries who have an influence or who are sponsoring or supporting one side or the other even dream that there is a possibility of a military solution. They may be wanting to be in a better position at the time of the negotiation, but no solution on a military nature. That is an important point, which means that regardless of what we are seeing, at the end of the day, there will be a need of a serious discussion, and a serious discussion about what has been agreed already in the UN Security Council resolution. Resolution 2254 is a roadmap.
Now, you have major players like the United States and Russia, which are leading efforts to find peace in Syria. What about regional countries like Iran? What role can they play?
They are very important, and they need to be engaged. And we want to engage them all the time. But of course, if the ISSG, which is this, the contact group made of more than 20 countries, is including all the regional players, that means Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, Oman, Emirates, and many other countries who are involved in Syria or in Iraq, and Iraq is actually there too, the beginning of a possible deal would be facilitated if Russia and America would agree, and then share it through us or directly with everyone else so that they can contribute to it. That's basically what we need to see more often.
Looking at all the steps that have to be taken to implement some kind of peace deal, the benchmarks, if you like, do you believe that groups like ISIS would have to be defeated first before there can be some kind of deal?
First of all, let me add one the important country that I take for granted to be mentioned, because they are members of the P5 and they're being actively involved in supporting our mission. I can only thank the strong support I've been getting from China in order to try to find a political solution. All their contributions have been very reasonable and very logical in terms of giving the chance to the Syrian people to decide on their own future, for instance, which is exactly what we are trying to do. Now, going back to Daesh, which is a common enemy of everyone, including China, they are taking advantage, like Ebola basically, of any weakness of a body. And they take advantage of the fact that at the moment, many players have different agendas, while all of them, in theory, should have one agenda as well, defeating Daesh. But fighting Daesh is possible, and they are doing it in one form or the other. Winning it, and here comes the point, winning it requires much more. Requires actually a political solution which includes those who feel not included in the political environment of Syria. That is the challenge, and that's why we are talking about, yes, fighting Daesh, but to win, we need a political solution which is leading to a political transition. Basically, again, Resolution 2254.
You know, you have been called the man with the toughest job in the world. This appears to be an intractable problem. We just heard from the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, this week. During an interview, he said that when you have many external factors that you do not control, it's going to drag on. He's talking about the war there. And no one in this world can tell you when the war will end. He doesn't sound very optimistic.
No, but I'm more optimistic than him. I believe instead that the regional players, and certainly Russia and America, and frankly China has always been of that line, this war has gone too far and too long and needs to be stopped. No one is winning. The only ones who are losing are the Syrian people. So I believe that we are not far, but there is a need for a political will. And that's why this cessation of hostilities, which was agreed upon between Russia and America, and was supported by everyone in the region, needs to be revitalized.
You know, the United States and Russia may have differences on a number of issues, but on this issue they seem to be moving in the right, or at least in the same direction. How important is US-Russian collaboration in bringing an end to this war?
Very important. One, because they do have an influence. Certainly, Russia has a substantial influence on the government of Syria. And on other regional players, they are an important player who are now involved militarily and therefore have assets on the ground. Plus have major interest. They don't want the terrorism to reach themselves. The US has a very strong priority in trying to, one, make sure that, again, Daesh does not expand its own influence and capabilities. B, to find a political solution to a tragedy, a humanitarian tragedy, which is the biggest tragedy since Second World War. And that is part of the legacy of President Obama, to want to make sure that he at least can say he tried everything he can. Right. When they agree, like on the 26th of February, everyone else is actually induced to at least not oppose it, and that's important.
You talk about the humanitarian tragedy. What about the plight of massive numbers of people who've been displaced inside Syria? Millions of people have been forced to leave the country. What does the future hold for them?
If you knew the Syrian people, you would know how proud they are of their country and of their own culture and tradition, and how much they love their own country. And they don't want to be refugees. They don't want to be displaced. They actually want to stay or come back. But we need at least to help them to avoid to see that their country is being destroyed.
Mr. Stefan de Mistura, thank you for joining us, sir. We are going to take a short break right now. Much more on Syria with an international panel. When we come back, stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the war in Syria after a day of deadly airstrikes on Aleppo. Is there any hope of reviving the recent ceasefire brokered by the United States and Russia? Joining me now via Skype from London is Amar Wakaf. He is the founder of Gnosos, an organization that offers opinion on Syria and the Middle East. Also with us from Providence, Rhode Island, is Vladimir Goldstein. He is an associate professor of Slavic Studies at Brown University. And with me here in the studio is David Gartenstein-Ross. He has served as a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome to all of you to the show. Let's go to London and start with Amar. We just heard from the UN Special Envoy there, Stefan de Mistura. He is hopeful that the ceasefire can be restored, and once restored, he's hopeful that aid can get through to those people who need it. Are you optimistic, given the fact that, you know, just shortly after the ceasefire was announced, we had a UN aid convoy that was bombed. We also had government forces now attacking Aleppo?
Well, good evening. Our estimate of the situation is that the United States has made a strategic shift. It's not a complete turnaround, but it's a strategic shift nonetheless, in trying to preserve certain fighting groups by ditching the Jabhat al-Nusra. And that, you know, is a good basis for a long-term agreement. And whether this specific ceasefire holds or not, the way things are going seems that they will come to an agreement later on. Probably what is happening at the moment is that the Syrian state and its Russian ally are telling the United States that they always have the alternative should an agreement not be fully implemented, or somebody doesn't like it or whatever, that they can go back to their old military tactic and strategy and strike hard at the rebels, which is the United States doesn't want, because at the end of the day they do not want a disintegration into in the rebel ranks. So at the end of the day, we think that whether in the coming week or even months it doesn't hold, then at least we've gone we've put our foot on the right step, on the right road. Sorry.
Vladimir, the Russians brokered the ceasefire with the Americans. What can Russia now do to make sure that that ceasefire is resuscitated in some way?
I don't think Russians are particularly optimistic at that moment. They, in fact, Lavrov and many others among Russian leadership said, as far as they're concerned, all these negotiations are over. And there is a clear reasons for that. You know, Russians were very, they worked very hard in negotiating. Their partners, Syrian government, kept their side of the bargain. And then what we have is this allied forces, United States, Australia, Denmark, bombing Syrian forces in Deir el-Zor, killing almost 65 people, and then throwing some kind of hissy fit saying that, Russians don't have a right to complain about it. But if you think about it, what kind of a message it sends to the Syrian people, that United States bomb the Syrian army, obviously in support of the enemies of the government. In other words, it's in support of terrorists who keep on fighting and attacking and bombing. Maybe it was a mistake, but the very quick reaction, almost happy response to that coming from Pentagon is not encouraging. Two leaders from Pentagon, Ashton Carter and General Joseph Dunford, were today or yesterday giving a testimony to the Senate, and they were saying, no, all negotiations are over. As far as we're concerned, we need more money. Our partners in the military business community need more money. So it's clear that the United States are not particularly interested in any peaceful negotiations.
Okay.
Pentagon working their angle, and so that's a very pessimistic. I view it until the elections. There is cannot be no positive talk about that.
All right, David, that U.S. attack on the Syrian position, do you believe that that was the reason the ceasefire broke down?
No, absolutely not. The ceasefire was, never respected in the first place. I mean, fighting went on the ground. There was a small cessation in fighting, and it seems to me that the reason for the cessation was much more the Eid al-Adha holiday rather than actually the fact that the ceasefire was making a difference on the ground. So number one, the fighting had continued. Number two, I think it is abundantly clear that the U.S. did in fact bomb accidentally, that was not an intentional bombing. I think it is irresponsible to suggest otherwise. I've been a huge critic of U.S. policy in Syria. I think U.S. policy is criminally negligent. But it did not bomb Deir ez-Zor to allow ISIS to advance, which is what happened after the bombing occurred. I think that this will be vetted. I don't understand how a mistake like that happened. But it's very clear looking at lines into the Pentagon that they didn't intend to do this. They certainly wouldn't intend to do so. The final thing is that with respect to a ceasefire like this, I do think a ceasefire is important. But I think one of the problems is the assumption that the U.S. has enough control over rebel factions to broker a ceasefire on their behalf.
Well, it's a point we brought up with Stefan de Mistura, that there is no enforcement mechanism of any kind here.
Well, moreover, the U.S., given its rather incoherent policy in Syria and the fact that it is only a minor player compared to countries like Qatar or Turkey or Saudi Arabia, I don't think the U.S. actually has the ability to go in and broker a ceasefire on the part of local rebel groups. I think it has to be brokered by those groups themselves and not the U.S. acting as their proxy, because I don't think the U.S. has that kind of control. This isn't the Cold War, when the great powers dictated facts on the ground for their proxies, it's a very different situation where the U.S. is more marginal and Russia is much more central than the U.S. is.
Right. And Amar, what are the chances of those opposition forces on the ground signing off on any kind of ceasefire? I mean, the war is now in its 6th year, and the Syrian government is already saying that its intention is to recover every last inch of land that it has lost, territory that it has lost to the rebels.
All right, I lost sound, so I'm going to start. Well, first of all, allow me to be a little bit irresponsible. I've just heard the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov quote an army spokesman on the Voice of America saying that they've actually acquired intelligence on the target that they bombed in Deir ez-Zor for about 2 days. And in 2 days, you know exactly who you are bombing. I don't think at all, and there is a strong argument that it was not unintentional at all. Probably the United States was telling Russia to stop pushing towards announcing the agreement, or that they can actually, if the agreement doesn't go ahead, that they can actually turn or upset the apple cart or whatever. Going back to your question, the difference between, and Mr. de Mistura touched on the February cessation of hostilities. There is a bit of a difference. At the time, well, the main theme still with regards to the armed groups is called Jabhat al-Nusra and their position vis-à-vis the other groups. Now, at the time, they issued a warning, a severe warning to the other groups, saying that if you go on with this and participate in the political solution, i.e. if you jump at the wagon, basically we will swallow you, we will convince your elements and members to defect, and so on and so forth. Now, Jabhat al-Nusra are changing tactic. They are saying, oh, we're going to integrate with you and we're going to rewrite, the battalions and reform everything. And the key issue here is that the likes, for example, of Saudi Arabia, probably Turkey as well, and Qatar, are arguing that if Jabhat al-Nusra is singled out, whilst it's actually the main striking force against the government forces in Syria, then that would severely hamper the rebels' fighting power, and that, at the end of the day,
right,
would make the government win. So this is the kind of dichotomy that we're in at the moment. The United States feels that it is important to ditch Jabhat al-Nusra to save the others, whilst the regional powers are saying, well, if we ditch Jabhat al-Nusra, then the government forces are going to win. So it's just a matter of trust, really.
Right, David, do you want to say something?
I think just the U.S.'s policy was never to support Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a designated terrorist group. I understand what the guest is saying, in that the moderate rebel groups who the U.S. supported did work with Nusra, which makes the U.S. policy all the more incoherent. But I just do want to point out that U.S. policy was never to support Nusra.
Vladimir, what kind of leverage or influence does Russia have over Bashar al-Assad right now?
I think Russia, was invited, the only country which was invited by a Syrian president to help. And when Lavrov negotiated with Kerry some kind of a peace, understanding was United States also want to help to have peace. But now, Russia has, a lot of leverage with Assad, but after their ally, Assad forces were bombed, intentionally or not, it doesn't really matter. I'm quite surprised what Americans bombers were doing in this area to begin with, if they were so much interested in keeping the peace. But they're obviously not interested in keeping the peace. So I think, Russia has the only one way to go is probably to help Syrians to take over Aleppo and then negotiate from the position of strength. Because otherwise, when they negotiate from the position of goodwill, as the position which de Mistura argued, which is a wonderful position of goodwill and taking care of Syrian people, but it's not happening. If other forces, opponents of the peace, are being encouraged, voluntarily or not, being encouraged to keep on fighting, then it's no clear solution. So Russia and we see that Russia is doing it. They start helping Syrians to bomb Aleppo until sort of the other side realizes that they have to negotiate, seriously negotiate.
Okay, David, how invested is the U.S. in finding a peaceful solution here. Syria was barely mentioned in the president's speech at the United Nations General Assembly. What are the options now for the U.S.?
That's a good question. I agree with what Amar had said at the outset, that there's a shift in U.S. policies, but it hasn't been a reversal. Look, if you look at what the U.S.'s policies have been, they're all over the map, right? At times...
Is the U.S. still insisting that Bashar al-Assad has to go?
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
I believe so. But the ceasefire would preserve Assad's position.
Right.
So it seems that there's a shift, but not actually a reversal in policy, which makes the U.S. position incoherent. I think that, look, I disagree with a lot of things the other guests said, as is quite obvious. Mm-hmm. But one thing that makes U.S. policies so suspect worldwide is that nobody understands, including, I think, within many layers of the government, what the U.S. policy actually is. The administration has never clarified it. At times, Kerry has compared Assad to Hitler. Other times, he suggests that Assad could stay. It's completely all over the map, inconsistent, incoherent.
Right, Amar, I've only got 20 seconds. What is going to happen next?
Well, I think the Syrian state and its Russian ally, as Vladimir said, that they are going to prove that they can always revert back to a military position where they have, where they can actually incorporate dominant resources. Right. And that would put them into a very good negotiating position.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And of course, we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts, comments on our Facebook page. You'll find that at CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.